and how far we've come from those simple cobbled tools to the camera that took the picture of the Earth from the far side of the moon, to the connectedness that we have, to the medical technology that we have. I mean, how does a headache pill know where your head is?
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. Now, I'm really excited to bring you this week's guest, Bob McDonald. He's an author, a science journalist, and he's the chief science correspondent for the CBC. And on that network, since 1992, he has been hosting Quirks and Quarks, a weekly science radio program that is listened to by over 800,000 people every week. Now, Bob and I have a wide-ranging conversation, to say the least, and that's partly because he's one of the most curious and knowledgeable people I've ever met. Here are just a few of the things that we talk about today. Photosynthesis, plate tectonics, the Big Bang, the anti-vaxxer movements, why 737 MAX 8s are falling out of the sky, how to make science fun, and the importance of storytelling in science, electricity, magnetism, the Large Hadron Collider, the evolution of recorded sound, the Renaissance, and on and on. At one point, Bob actually looked out the window and described to me exactly what makes a flag flap in the wind, the science behind it, the terminology behind it. All of this was impromptu and without notes. But all of this also contained deeper seeds and deeper meanings. Bob is anxious about the future. We talk about climate change, of course, and the issues, the major obstacles that are in front of us. We talk about how human beings have come so far and that we have the capacity to overcome these massive challenges, but we have to ask what we are leaving behind. We have to ask, why are we considering ourselves separate from the world around us when in fact we are part of the same ecosystem? We have to also ask the difference between information and knowledge. This is a really, really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Now, just to remind you that the episodes of this podcast are all at the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca, and at that site you can also get in touch with me by email or on social media. Let me know what you think of this show, and also give me your feedback and send me your suggestions for future guests and future episodes. I look forward to hearing from you. Bob McDonald, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
We're here at Casa Cappuccino in Barrie, Ontario. You're someone whose career I've followed for a while. I love your show, Quirks and Quarks. And I've read some of your books as well. But there's something that's actually even more interesting to me, which is that your career as a science journalist started with you communicating science to kids, and you still do that to this day, and your work is imbibed with that spirit. And one thing that we try to do in this program sometimes is ask questions as if we were a 5-year-old. So explain it to me as if I'm 9 years old, for example. And you do that so well. And that makes you, I think, an ideal guest on this program. So for that reason alone, thank you, Bob, for coming.
Well, you're welcome. You don't look like a 5-year-old.
Sometimes
5-year-olds are pretty smart, you know.
They are.
Or 9-year-olds, yeah.
Well, and that's actually a theme on this, is that when I'm speaking to people who do, whether it's scientific work, I was talking to a chemist the other day, Kathleen Crudden from Queen's University, and she mentioned that in order to be a scientist, she has to have the mind of a child. Mm-hmm. She has to be able to let go of her preconceptions and ask a question that a child would ask.
Because that's what science is. Science is about curiosity. Science is asking questions. You look around and you say, why is the sky blue? How do plants grow? You ask questions that kids would ask, and then you find out that the answer to that is not simple. Mm-hmm. It's really complex. You know, why is the sky blue? You get into this whole thing called Rayleigh scattering, or why are plants green? And you get the miracle of photosynthesis. There are still parts of that we don't know. I mean, plants take light and turn it into food. We can't do that. We can't turn light into food. Mm-hmm. We turn their food into food, but that's amazing. You know, you discover all these amazing things, and that's what science does. It's just a very organized way of being curious.
So how do you, I mean, this is before my first question, which we don't normally do, but that's fine. How do you stay curious? Where does it come from? Is it just something that's preternatural to you, or is it something you have to work at?
No, I don't have to work at it at all, because there's so much we don't know about the world. We think we're so smart here in the 21st century. We are. I mean, we figured a lot out. We've gone from thinking the world is at the center of the universe and is flat, but to a ball that's falling through an unimaginably large space that's getting bigger by the second. But most of the universe is made of dark energy, dark matter. That's 95% of what's out there. We haven't got a clue what it is. So we don't even know what most of the universe is made of. And we still don't understand processes. We don't understand the connections between the atmosphere and the oceans. And we can't predict the weather beyond 5 or 6 days. We don't know when the next earthquake's going to happen. We can't tell when the next tsunami's going to hit. So science is also trying to understand relationships between things and see patterns. And there's still a lot we don't know. And every week on my show, scientists show up and they tell me their stories about what they just figured out. That's the beauty of my job. It's always new. Every week, it's always new. And it doesn't matter whether it's big subjects like the expansion of the universe or cosmology or where did we come from, or the sex life of some insect in Borneo that's got some really innovative way of doing things. It's all new. And it's all new. Whether you go down to the very small or the very large, it's all new.
Well, and you've interviewed over 7,000 scientists, and that was as of 2013, so maybe we're up to 8,000 now. And after so much that you're digging into this, it's amazing to hear that it remains new, remains fresh, and it also remains that you are on the cutting edge of this.
Absolutely. I feel like a surfer on the cutting edge of our knowledge. And what I find interesting when I'm talking to scientists is when I talk to senior scientists or people who've won the Nobel Prize, very often they'll say something like, well, I know a little bit about that. What do you mean you know a little? You just won the Nobel Prize. They say, yeah, but there's still so much. They like to talk about what they don't know, about what's coming. Whereas if I'm interviewing a freshly minted PhD, they want to tell me everything they know.
Sure.
And they talk like they just figured out the whole universe. So anybody who says they haven't figured out is usually wrong.
Well, it's so interesting because, a lot of people say, well, we haven't really moved our scientific advancement that much since the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which I find ridiculous. I know you find it ridiculous.
Absolutely.
But one example of that is plate tectonics. And you talked about processes, and this is such a fascinating insight that we didn't know anything. We didn't even know that plate tectonics existed until about 40, 50 years ago. Prior to that, we had a very different understanding of how our own ground moved underneath us.
And the guy who proposed that, Alfred Wagner, he wasn't a geologist. He was a polar scientist. But the story goes, he and his wife were looking at a map of the world, deciding where to take a vacation. And he said, hey, honey, do you notice that South America and Africa look like they used to be together? I wonder if continents move. And he wrote it up in a paper, and he presented it at a geological conference. They laughed him out of the room. They said, who are you saying this? Rocks can't move. Continents don't float on oceans. The oceans are made of rock and all that. But here we have plate tectonics. And yeah, you're right. And the fact that the Earth changes over time, that the face of the Earth changes the way your face has changed since you were a baby. It's very slow. So right now, Barry here is moving towards China at about the few centimeters a year, which is about the time it takes or about the same speed that your fingernails are growing. That's how fast we're moving. It's not a lot.
They should put that on their. They should put that on their sign. Barry, moving at the pace of a fingernail.
Yeah.
Or something. So
towards the west.
You actually said in a TED Talk a couple years ago that science is the way that we know things that we can't know through intuition and our five senses.
That's correct.
That science tells us things that we can't possibly understand in any other way. We're not going to intuit that we're moving towards China at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters a year. We're not going to.
Absolutely.
And we're not going to figure that out through our perceptions of the world either. We're going to have to use inference. We're going to have to use other tools that come with science.
Because our five senses show us the world in a very limited way, and the way we see the world through our five senses is wrong. Because the ground is always down, the sky is always up, and the earth looks generally flat. That's not the way it is. And if you walk long enough in any direction, you'll come to an ocean. So it looks like we live on an island, which we actually do. And the horizon has a sharp edge to it that looks like you could fall off. And if you don't have a ship that can go far enough, you might as well believe that. And so that's our perception of the world. We live on an island, and the sky's just this big dome over our head. Half of it's blue with clouds and sun stuck on it, and the other half is black with the stars and the moon and the planets. So it took a lot of science to figure out that the way we see the world is wrong. And so we're constantly doing that. We're always discovering that, hey, I thought this was like that, but it's not. It's some other way, and we're keep refining it. So is the scientific revolution over? No. Look what we're doing in genetics. Look what we're doing in microbiology and quantum physics and all of this weird stuff that we're figuring out how forces work. We still don't understand all the forces that hold the atom together and how they work, or what happened at the Big Bang and this it's just we're still discovering so much.
And to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that science is the process of moving, for example, closer and closer and closer to the exact second of the Big Bang, or the exact moment of it, the millisecond of a millisecond. And that we will never maybe get there. We will never maybe get all the way there, but science is the process of getting closer and closer to knowing as much as we can, even if we know we'll never fully get there.
Some people are looking at what happened before the Big Bang. You talk about a question that a kid asked. There's a cosmologist who his question is, what went bang? What was it that went bang? Because it wasn't anything that we have today. The temperatures were so high, the pressures were so high that anything that exists today could not exist back then. It was pure energy. But what was it? Where did it come from? What was it? Was there something before that got squeezed that tightly that it had to blow up? We don't know.
Well, and this is such an interesting question because it goes to the heart of what science is and what it does. Stephen Hawking, when asked that question, said, what happened before the Big Bang? He said, what's north of the North Pole, right? Not to say that it's a ridiculous question, but to say that you might need to reframe the question, or you might need to dig into philosophy, right? Which is where science has originally come from, going back to the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
But Bob, I wanted to go back because I want to give you the chance to answer the question of the program. I don't want to. We're gonna. Otherwise, we'll get to minute 55 and be like, oh, we didn't give him the chance. I want to give you the opportunity, Bob, to do it. So, what on earth is going on?
We are living in remarkable times. We are living longer than humans have ever lived. There are more of us than have ever been. We are able to connect with each other through incredible technology, with communication. There is so much information out there, and we have figured so much out. And I find that amazing. And I feel privileged to be alive at this time, especially in Canada. We're not under war. Nobody's shooting at us. Nobody's trying to take away what we have. Here in Canada, we have clean air, clean water, lots of food, and we're well off. What an amazing place to be. Most of the world's not like that. So we're extremely privileged here in Canada to live in this amazing country. At the same time, I get discouraged when I see that science, which has given us so much and is one of the last institutions that actually looks for the truth, that's what science does, just wants to know the truth, how do things work, is being dismissed by people with opinions, people with corporate agendas, people with religious agendas, conspiracy theorists, and they're getting a lot of airtime. And they're confusing the public to say that science is uncertain, and that really bothers me. It really bothers me a lot. And it's up to the scientists to try to keep the door open to say, look, here's the truth. Here's what's really going on. But scientists aren't being believed anymore.
Is that new, or are we just noticing it more today?
I think we're just noticing it more today because of the communication. The people who are denying science are very well funded and very good at what they do. They're better at it than scientists are. So they're getting a lot of airtime. And even if you don't fully believe them, they can cast doubt. That's really what they want to do. Just put doubt in the public mind and stall the process so that we won't proceed with getting rid of fossil fuels to take care of climate change. You know, there are big fat elephants in the room that don't want to move. And so they're very good at doing that. So it's really, I'm hoping that common sense will eventually prevail. Or the Earth itself will begin to talk to us, which it is. We're starting to see it now. That we'll take some positive action instead of listening to all this garbage.
This instilling of doubt, it feels like a sort of rhetorical jujitsu, right? Because it's using that which makes science work against science. I mean, right. Any scientist is dubious. Any scientist has doubt about not only their own field, but about any other. They're skeptics by nature.
Yes.
And by using skepticism against science, it's almost the perfect storm because no scientist can say, well, I know for sure. And as soon as you do, you're trapped.
Well, yes. And not knowing for sure is how science works. It builds on itself. So you come up with something that you figure out by asking your question, doing your experiments, coming up with your results. You throw it out to the community, say, here, what do you think? That's peer review. If they don't like it or if they shoot it down, they don't just say, I don't like it. They say, well, here's an alternative to that. I have another way of looking at it. And then you debate and you come up with what you all want to know as the truth. And then even then, over time, instrumentation gets better, telescopes get bigger, microscopes get more powerful. And in the future, some young scientist comes along and says, well, look, I can modify this even more. And so it builds on itself. Whereas if you have somebody who says, oh, well, I've got it all figured out, that's it. So there's a phrase that came from a scientist who at one point was the head of the Skeptic Society, which isn't a scientific organization. And he said, when a scientist says, I don't know, that's when the investigation begins. When a creationist says God did it, that's when the investigation ends, because you've got your answer. You become narrow-minded and you don't look any further, whereas science is always looking, always looking. We could be wrong, so let's keep at this. Let's not give up. And that's what bothers me with the conspiracy theorists and all that, is that it becomes narrow-minded. You say, well, I've already got my answers, and then you stop looking for new evidence. And I get bothered by people who are still throwing around things like, well, vaccinations cause autism. That was one scientific paper that came out about 15 years ago and has since been disproven again and again and again, and yet people still carry that myth around because it's in the public mind. Mm-hmm. Because it keeps getting promoted by ill-informed or narrow-minded or people using old data.
Well, and a big part of this, too, is the technology that we use that creates false equivalency, right? So that a Facebook post that talks about vaccination from a scientist is put at the same level and the same degree of authenticity, and it might be shared by someone that I trust with someone who put out a post about, that one single paper and anti-vaccinations.
Which is why I'm all for scientific literacy, starting with the kids up. You don't have to be a scientist, but know there's a little bit of science when it comes to issues like that, and don't just take sides. Don't just take sides on what looks like a debate, because very often there's not a debate. There's no debate in the scientific community about climate change. There's argument about the intensity of it and the rapidity of it, because there are uncertainties there, but there's no doubt about whether or not it's happening. So when deniers come along and say, oh, it's just a hoax, it's just a government cover-up or something like that, where's their evidence? Show me the evidence. If you're going to talk science, if you're going to argue it with science, not just an opinion.
Well, and this is an interesting question for any journalist, as you are, or anybody who's in the media, whether a podcast like that or, say, at CBC in Canada. How do you talk about these issues, not necessarily in a debate, but do you give a platform to those people who we know are espousing things that are demonstrably false or who will not bring new evidence to the table? I mean, if we're not talking necessarily about false equivalency. We don't want to have a climate scientist debating a climate change skeptic or denier every single day until the end of time. But there must be more to it than that. But how do we respond as people who are trying to talk about things in a dialogue that everybody has access to?
Well, I'm in a fortunate position because my program, Quirks and Quarks, is pure science. We let the science stand on its own. So we want to tell you what's new and what's out there. And we'll take on issues, but we'll do it from the scientific point of view. And there's usually more than one point of view within the science. So we don't have debates like that. Now, we are going to have one coming up in June, as we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the first moon landing. So we're going to have a public forum on which is better, sending people into space or sending robots into space. Robots are a lot cheaper than people, but people are dramatic and they add something to it. So we're going to have that debate. So there's no real answer to that, but it's something worth talking about as we go into the future. So that's not an either. Well, like it's not a yes/no kind of talk. So no, we won't bring in I keep getting emails from people say, well, why don't you have a creation scientist? Well, to me that's an oxymoron. There is no creation science there. That's an opinion, and the creationists will very often manipulate scientific terminology to their own good, but they're not really making sense when you get right down to it. But what happened to the Big Bang, the moment of creation as science knows it? What do we know about that? Okay, well, let's find out. Let's see where we are. And let the science stand on its own. And so we hope that's enough
right.
to do that, because not many programs go into the depth of the science that we do.
Right, and that's part of it. Well, and going to another debate, sort of a meta debate, part of it is if we let the science stand on its own, will it be strong enough? And if to rational thinkers like you are, and I hope that I am, would say, well, of course it should be, because it's self-evident, or it will prove itself. I mean, you're not entitled to your own facts in the same way that you're entitled to your own opinions, for example, right? But what we're seeing in this technological change, and it comes from your very first response to our world of connectivity, that everything is so connected in an increasing way. If science can stand on its own to those who are rational, how do we make sure? Is it just about science literacy? Is it just about education? Yeah.
There's a phrase that I heard years ago when the information age was really just beginning. And it was kids, young people are information rich but knowledge poor. And I've seen this when I'm asked to judge science fairs or things like that. And I'll see these kids that can spout back stuff that they found on the internet or from their parents that's up on their board. But when I start asking them about the basics behind it, they don't know. They don't understand. And that bothers me because you got to understand fundamental principles, not just the facts. And when you have so much information around you, it doesn't really stick. It's just another piece of information. And you don't need to remember it because you can look it up on your phone. And we need that. You need to have a fundamental understanding of things. Like I look around and I see patterns. Like just outside the window here, there's a couple of flags that are blowing in the wind. Well, that's very nice, but what's going on there? Well, what's really happening is that as the wind goes around the pole is creating vortices, which are whirlpools in the air, and they're traveling down the length of the flag, first from one side then the other. They're alternating, and that's what gives the flag that flappy look there. But they're whirlpools of air traveling down from the pole. The turbulence from the pole is causing the flag to stick out, and that's why it flaps back and forth. If the turbulence wasn't there, the flag would be just straight out and wouldn't flap. So there's an interesting thing. So I'm talking about aerodynamics, I'm talking about vortices, I'm talking physics, and I'm talking climate, because if the wind wasn't blowing, well, you want to talk about why the wind blows? There's another question.
Yeah.
So we can keep going and going and going.
Right.
So I'm doing that all the time, and that I find that understanding fundamental concepts of science like that helps me see things. So when an issue comes up, then I'll say, okay, well, I know the principle behind that. So now I can see what the scientist is saying that agrees with that fundamental principle, and then I see this idiot over here that's saying that he or she doesn't believe it and they don't have any good reasons.
Right.
Because I understand the fundamentals. So it's really important for young people that we get the fundamentals to them. Just really basic stuff, how things work.
And the principles, too, which is another word that you use. That what are the principles that animate the world around us, right?
Yeah.
Not only just in how a flag moves or in how a coffee might be brewed and delivered to this table, but the principles of human nature, the principles of how we have this conversation, the principles of language.
Yeah.
To me, all of this is really, really interesting, and that's, I think, where science literacy begins. Because we don't all have to know exactly how a flag moves. In fact, it's probably impossible for everybody to understand the explanation that you just gave. Mm-hmm. But hopefully they're curious about it, and hopefully they understand the principles that are underneath it, so that we create a sort of a base of knowledge as opposed to a constant accumulation of information, as you said.
Well, let me just relate that flag to, it's the same phenomena going on with that flag that's knocking the 737 MAX 8s out of the air. Because they get to a critical angle of attack, you get turbulence on top of the wing, it stalls, and the plane flies. The plane flops out of the air.
Right.
It's the same principle that's going on with that flag, happening on the wing of a MAX 8. So
yeah, I was speaking to a pilot about this, a pilot who flies the MAX 8 and is currently grounded as a result of the international grounding of that plane, and how common sense it is what happens. However, how complicated the machinery is that causes this, and the program that causes this malfunction, well, we don't know because the investigations haven't been completed yet, but presumably this program was not known to the pilots who are flying this plane.
Which comes down to education again.
Right, right. And so we're talking about principles and knowledge and information, and I find this interesting because as you were describing the way that flag moves, I was taken back to my own creativity, not just my search for knowledge and information, although maybe it's the same or related. But what is my creative response to that? Mm-hmm. In other words, how do I tell a story that uses that? Or how do I communicate something that's maybe even dramatic? So I have a theater background, which I know you can relate to. And you did theater for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there's something there that inspires that part of me, too. Sure. And I know that in one of your recent programs of Quirks and Quarks, there was a discussion about the actor's brain. How the actor's brain will think and spark differently if they're in character or role-playing. It's something that we all do.
Yes, the part of your brain that identifies self is shut down.
Right. And therefore, other parts of your brain that identifies as other people bring up. And that's been a theme of this show. We've talked about that, not particularly that episode, but this idea of the self and who am I. Will Storr's Selfie comes to mind. It's a really interesting book by a British author about where this self-centered culture, this narcissistic culture that we seem to be living in comes from and how it resides in the brain. And I bring this up because of role-playing and the principles that we're talking about. Does a scientist need to, or just someone who's interested in science, someone who wants to be science literate, do you need to take yourself out of yourself into another role or another paradigm in order to understand the world around us? Or is it this constant accumulation of my knowledge over and over and over again?
Well, part of the mandate of all scientists is to be able to communicate it to the public, and they're not all good at that. We have a problem on Quirks. We have 2 criteria for our program: good story, which there are a lot of, and good storytellers, which there are not many. And a lot of scientists don't make it on the show, because before they get to me, my producers call them up on the phone and have a little chat with them. And a lot of them just cannot communicate. They just can't do it. They can't get out of the jargon, or they just have difficulty. And so it's a search for us for good storytellers. And that's really what we do. We tell stories. That's what we do in the media, is tell stories, whether it's science or drama or whatever. And science has to have that. That's also why we have science centers and museums, to try to bring the science alive in innovative ways. And, I spent a good part of my early career at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, making science fun, making it fun. Make kids laugh about it, but also at the same time, hopefully involve a principle there sometime that they'll take home with them.
So if there was one principle that if I'm a scientist who wants to get on your show and I'm talking to the producer, what should I do? What should I do?
Publish in a recent paper.
but in order to make it an interesting or fun or inspiring story, in order to be a good storyteller,
I would be asking you what amazed you about it. Were you surprised by this? Why did you get into it in the first place? Make it a personal story. What was your curiosity? What made you ask that question? How'd you feel when you got your results? What are you going to do next? Those are all personal questions. Those aren't scientific questions, but we always include that in our interviews. And the best interviews we have are people who say, well, I was playing tennis one day and I started thinking about the fuzz on the ball, and I wondered how does that relate to the aerodynamics of the ball, or what's it work? And then I found out that owls have little fuzzy feathers along their leading edge of their wings, and that's why owls don't make sound when they flap their wings. I'm an aerodynamicist, so I went from a tennis game to the wing of an owl. So now I'm fascinated by that. Now I want to understand how hummingbirds can hover. Well, isn't that neat?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of neat. Now, there's a whole lot of physics involved in that, with boundary layers and turbulence and all the rest of it, that you could get into if you just stuck with the science. But it's a personal story, because there's somebody who was just doing something ordinary, started asking a question, looked at one little thing, and came out with a scientific answer.
Well, and that's the doorway for any student or person with curiosity to go through. For example, the apocryphal story of the apple falling on Newton's head to give him the idea of gravity.
Which never happened.
We're right, and that's our entrance into it, is why was he curious about this? Why are all of these people curious about these things? Why are you curious about the things that you talk about? And that's our way in to someone who doesn't know. Because if I can find out why you're curious, I might be able to go, and this is storytelling and empathy, I might be able to go on the same journey that you went on.
Right. Well, Newton was actually looking at the apple tree. It was out the window of his house in Lincolnshire. That tree's still there, by the way. It's a national site. But he was saying, he was also looking at the moon. He was looking at the moon in the sky, and he's saying, well, if an apple falls from a tree, why doesn't the moon fall from the sky? What's holding the moon up there? How come it doesn't fall? And he contemplated gravity, and that's where he really started to figure out the principles of gravity, and the fact that the moon doesn't fall. It is actually falling, but it just happens to be moving sideways at just the right speed that it doesn't hit the Earth. But it's actually falling around it. So he took the concept of gravity as not just something that goes straight to the center of the Earth, but you can bend it a little bit if you move. Things change when you move. So that's what Newton was doing. But again, he was looking at an ordinary thing.
Well, and like Einstein, who sort of replaced Newtonian physics, was looking out the side of the window of a train and thinking about what would happen if I throw something. I know that if I throw a rock, it will maintain the same velocity of the train, but what happens when a beam of light shoots out of the train? Yeah. Fascinating. Again, Einstein was more than just a guy riding the train and figuring things out. I mean, he had an education and he was a very profound thinker. But these gateways into science are, and they're about storytelling. And the reason I bring this up is because you are such a very interesting but also very experienced storyteller. Going back to your early days when you were working at the museum. And I think it's a very interesting journey that you've taken that can illuminate how to get into science for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we do in the media. We tell stories. And even if it's science, every story has a setting, every story has characters, every story has action, there's going to be some kind of tension there. And that's what we do. So we build it that way. So we set the scene. So where were you? I was working on the Serengeti Plains of Africa and studying lions. Oh, that's really neat. So what were you interested in about the lions? Well, and go on there. I was. This actually happened. I had a guy said he was on the Serengeti and he was looking for lions, and he just walked around this bush, and there was a lion sleeping in the grass on the other side of the bush, and he didn't see it, and he actually tripped over it. And he said he got up and screamed. The lion got up and screamed, and they both ran in opposite directions.
That's fantastic.
So that was the setup to the story. Then we go, okay, so what were you trying to find out about lions? But again, it's telling it in a personal, interesting way. And so journeys in science come in many forms. There's the journey of the science itself as it explores the unknown, but there's the personal journeys of the people who are doing it and why they do it.
Here's something that Bob said that stuck with me. When a scientist says, "I don't know," the investigation begins. When a creationist says that, say, God did it, the investigation ends. I think it's important in dealing with any problem that we want the investigation, the search, to begin rather than end. In science, the investigation is always ongoing. It is infinite. There is no endpoint in science. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about Bob's background, we talk about what he sees in the future, and why we should avoid 5 and 10, even 20-year plans, and maybe even make a 1,000-year plan. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. So I want to go back and ask you this very same question. When you were working at the Ontario Science Centre all those years ago, making science fun, one of your earliest preoccupations was space, outer space, space travel, astronauts. Why was that interesting to you? Was it just this idea of the voyage to something else, or what was it?
Two things. I've had to think about this because I've always been interested in space. One of them was when I was living just north of here in the town of Orillia. When I was a kid, I was 8 years old, my mother brought me a book that I still have called The Planets. And at that time, we hadn't had any spacecraft out. I think Sputnik was the only one, the first satellite. So we hadn't been to the planets. But it's an art book, and it was a realistic art book showing what the planets are like, and if you could go there, what they might look like.
Were there canals on Mars at the time?
Yes, there were canals on Mars, and there was either deserts on Venus or a marsh. They didn't know. They knew it was hot, but they didn't know if it was a desert or a marsh. But nonetheless, this book captivated me that there were other worlds out there, that the Earth was only one of a whole family of planets, and all of them are really different. And I knew that at 8 years old, so I was always fascinated by planets. And then they landed on the moon. We had the space race. I grew up in the space race, and I watched that happen. I watched all the moon landings, not just the first one. And I was fascinated by this, and everything was happening so fast, I figured that by the time I'm dyeing my hair gray like I do now in the 21st century, we'd be vacationing on the moon. We'd be taking a holiday on Mars. Hasn't quite happened that way, but that was, so I grew up in that. And you know what's interesting about that time? Because the United States was so afraid that the evil Soviet Union was ahead of them technologically, which they were, they changed the school curriculum to bring science to the forefront. Math, science, engineering, STEM, right? That was brought to the forefront. And I went through that as well. I took a lot of science in school. That's kind of gone away now. What's happening now? There's a president of the United States who thinks climate change is a hoax, who can barely read and doesn't know any science at all. And he's an economist. He just, all he thinks about is making money. And so the science has gone to the background, and it's totally backwards now. I find it very odd that it's kind of flipped around.
Well, and
that's where my interest in space came from, anyway.
And I'm just continuing on from that. This is a really interesting question for me, that I ask this question, what on earth is going on, to all kinds of people, right? Mm-hmm. And I always get cultural answers, I get political answers, I get Donald Trump is going on, or why is Donald Trump happening, or populism in general. Yeah, right. We talk about connectivity, we talk about optimism and pessimism. There's one thing I never hear, which is, what on earth is going on? We're going to the stars. What on earth is going on? We're exploring the universe. I don't hear that as a response. I think I might have heard that in the 1960s after JFK said by the end of the decade we're going to get to the moon. I don't know. I'm being counterfactual, but I suspect that we're missing a whole world of exploration. And I just, first of all, I'm wondering if you find that true. But second of all, why is that? Why are we not grappling on to this wonderful adventure that we could be going on to explore an limitless universe?
Well, we have the potential to do that if we want to. The technology's there. It was interesting during growing up in the space age because not only was it exciting to see humans hopping around on the moon in that low gravity and doing all those things, but we got that iconic picture of the Earth from the moon, the Earthrise picture, and then it was right after that Earth Day came along, the Environmental Protection Agency came along, Environment Canada came along. So the environmental movement started around the same time, combined with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. That all happened around the same time in the late 1960s. And so everybody got a holistic sense of the Earth, and we thought about it as just one living unit, and that this thing is isolated in a very violent universe. The universe will kill you. It's not like Star Trek. The moon will kill you. Buzz Aldrin said, the moon's a nice place, or an interesting place, but it's not a very nice place. And it'll kill you in seconds. So will Mars. There's no oxygen on Mars. So we saw that, and this wonderful philosophical way of looking at ourselves as a big blue marble, as just one unit, has disappeared. We've lost that holistic thinking. Now we're down to individualistic thinking again. What can I get out of this? What toys can I have? I want to have the fastest car. I want to have the biggest house. I want to have the most money. And when we stop thinking holistically like that and just think about ourselves, we get very possessive. We build walls around ourselves, which is happening. They're building walls, right? You want to keep everyone else away from your treasures. And that bothers me a lot. One of the best things I did in my life was in my late 20s, I went all the way around the Earth by myself. I circled the globe alone. And the big lesson that came out of that was that people are generally good. People are generally good. Even in poor countries. I went through Africa. I went through Asia and places. And people were so good to me all the way along. People who had nothing to give would take me in for the night and put me out on the road again the next morning. And I found that humanity is generally good, but when we start thinking about money and politics and corporate greed and things, what we see on the news and war is not the way most people are. Most people don't want to be like that. So we have tremendous potential, but we're getting caught up in the minutia of it. So I'd like to see some more holistic thinking again. And the science is still trying to do that. The science is saying, look, the climate, there's only one climate of the Earth. There's only one atmosphere. And so even though it's clean here in Canada, it's not clean in Beijing right now, or that anything we put into the air is going to spread around the planet. So let's get back to that holistic, whole planet thinking. One atmosphere, one ocean, one biosphere, one cryosphere, one geosphere with plate tectonics. And they're all connected to each other. We don't understand all those connections. So let's get back to that kind of thinking so we can integrate ourselves into it. We've always thought of ourselves as separate from the world. That's also a religious philosophy, right? The kingdom is ours for the taking. Well, actually, that's not true. We're part of the kingdom. And I think slowly we're beginning to think more like that let's integrate ourselves into it. It doesn't mean going back to the caves. We can still have our modern society. I'm actually an optimist. If common sense prevails. We can still have cars, but there's just something else under the hood turning the wheels that's not spewing out CO2 and carbon monoxide.
Well, and I think we'll furthermore be happier, healthier, better, stronger people if we're surrounded by other people who are better, healthier, stronger, wiser, but also by an environment that is healthier, stronger, whatever.
Yes.
And the reason I say that is because it's easy to go down these rabbit holes of self-interest, right? And building walls, but also trying to accumulate things or taking photos of myself, whatever I can do to increase the dopamine levels in my brain to make me happy.
Me.
That's right, me. But what we don't realize is that we're actually doing ourselves, we're less happy as a result. The happiest we can be is when we're doing service to someone else or service to an idea.
Yeah.
Being part of that holistic thing that you talk about. And it's interesting because there's this tremendous gap between the world as we know it when we travel. And I did similar traveling in my late 20s. I went across Africa and had the exact same takeaway, that people are generally good. There are some bad people out there, but they're usually in places where they're conditioned to be bad.
Yes,
for example, where tourism is high.
Right, but the people who are bad are still a small minority of the people who are actually there.
Right.
And the same way, a lot of people are afraid to go to Toronto. Oh, you might get shot. No. I lived in Toronto most of my life. And it's getting out of your walls, and I'm glad that you've done some travel, because I think travel is one of the best education you can get. Get off North America and go see what the rest of the world looks like. and just have a look and appreciate what whenever you travel, you appreciate what you left behind. Right?
Well, and not just see what it looks like, see what it feels like, and see what happens when you don't know what's next. Because I think we can watch movies about what it's like to be in Venice. We can even go into a virtual reality and see what the Serengeti looks like. But we're not at the hands of it. No. And I think we can even go on a cruise and go into different cities, but we're always safely back on the cruise ship. When you go into a city and you have to find a place to stay, or when you're in the middle of nowhere and you have to rely on the kindness of others, this may not be for everybody. But I think that the scientific mind is related here. Yeah. And I'm just bringing it back in that I think that the role of the scientist is to get lost and find your way out of a certain subject. In the same way, the role of a true traveler is to kind of get lost in a culture and a language and in a people and find your way out of it.
I found getting lost was the best experience because you have to ask for help. And people fall all over themselves to help you.
Yeah, even if they don't know. I had that experience so many times in Africa traveling across because I drove across and you'd ask for directions because, there was no internet to look for your directions, and sometimes the map was just utterly unclear. Yeah. So you'd say, could you point me the way to wherever I'm going? And the guy would clearly not know, but would be so wanting to help you that he would point to what he thought might be the right direction.
Yeah, but I had people say, well, why don't you come in for some cha? Come into our house and have some cha. You're from Canada. I have relatives in Canada, or my Joe across the street has relatives, and it would become a party. That happened to me more often than not. Or it's late in the day. Why don't you stay over? Put you back on the road in the morning. I hitchhiked across Australia. That happened to me every night. Every night, people took me into their homes, and I was in farmhouses. I was in the house of a 4-star general one night.
Wow!
And all kinds of people, the whole spectrum of society took me in every night. Never failed.
Not to share another anecdote, but which is what I'm doing. But when I was in New Zealand, I was hitchhiking as well across the country, and I was hitchhiking on Christmas Eve, and finally got a ride outside of Christchurch, of all places, where the massacre occurred in March of 2019, where 50 people were killed. And, of course, this is where there was an earthquake as well. But right outside of Christchurch, I got picked up by an absolute stranger in a sports car and ended up having Christmas dinner with him and his buddy. We had crayfish and lamb, and it was one of my favorite experiences in my life. And it only happened because, as they say, put yourself out there and the universe will provide. That might be one way of looking at it. But another way is go put yourself in a situation where you have to figure it out. Yeah. And again, going back to science and scientists, the whole goal, it seems, is to figure out something that we don't know yet, and the only way we don't know is because we're lost in the midst of it.
Well, our ignorance far exceeds our knowledge. It has always been that way. It's still that way today. I find that exciting. Let's penetrate that ignorance and see what we can find out. And very often, when you're doing basic science, that's why there's two different kinds of science. There's the applied science, where you try to make a better microphone or a better cell phone or whatever, and you get a product out of it. But there's also basic science where you just ask a question and you don't know what it might lead to. How do things work? I think of a British scientist, Michael Faraday. He was interested in the relationship between electricity and magnetism. And he knew they were connected, but he didn't know how. And he figured out that connection, that if you wave a magnet over a wire, you make a current in the wire by just moving the magnet. Well, that's the principle behind all generators and motors and everything, and all electric devices that we have today use that principle that Faraday was just trying to answer a very fundamental question. So when you ask basic questions like that, usually you come up with technologies or solutions that you weren't even looking for, the surprises, and that's really neat. So that's why we have to keep going for the basics. Ask fundamental questions because we still don't know a lot about them, and let scientists, just pay some scientists to just think. Just pay them to think, not knowing what they're going to come up with. Like there may not be a practical application. The largest experiment on the planet right now, the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, which is trying to smash things together to see what comes out of it, is trying to understand the Big Bang. That has nothing to do with our income tax. It has nothing to do with any technology that we have today. It is fundamental science. But coming out of that, they're going to understand the very forces that hold everything together that the universe runs by. And it's by understanding forces that we've been able to manipulate those forces and do things. So we can manipulate electricity and magnetism and make cars and electric motors run. But imagine if we could manipulate gravity. We can't do that yet. Imagine if we could turn gravity off. Wouldn't that be nice? That'd be so convenient. Going up hills wouldn't be a problem anymore. Or if you could make gravity push instead of pull, we could just push ourselves off the planet using the gravity of the Earth. We can't do that. We'd have warp drive, which that's the principle behind warp drive. Surf a gravitational wave. Well, we just discovered gravitational waves a couple of years ago.
I was just going to ask you about that, yeah.
Yeah, so we finally saw them. That's a fundamental force of the universe. They go right across the entire universe. Can we manipulate them yet? No. Might we in the future? Maybe. So you got to keep at the basics. You got to keep at the unknown and keep going and just see what we can find out. I think there are still revolutions yet to happen in physics and biology and genetics. There's still so much we don't know.
Well, and that I think is a really core principle for me, and I think for other people, that we don't know how we're going to apply it, and that doesn't matter yet.
No, it doesn't matter at all.
In the same way that if I'm going to go to a play, again, going back to theater, if I'm going to go engage in a story, read a novel, have a conversation with somebody, I don't know what's going to come out of it, and maybe in practical terms, nothing. Maybe my income tax will be exactly the same as it was right before, but it doesn't matter, because the things that will come out with it might come out 20 years from now. There might be something that happens 20 years from now.
It'll be your grandchildren who will appreciate it.
Right. Someone will listen to this episode of the podcast 20 years from now, the one listener in 20 years, and will find something that will spur them on to something else, or I will discover something 20 years from now, or whatever it is. That doesn't have to be an immediate applicable benefit to something for there to be the power of it. And this goes, back to the space program. The International Space Station is questioned by many people as a waste of money. Well, if you see everything in terms of a transaction, as money being going from one side to the other, well then, okay, fine, because there is no money being made from it. They're not printing money in outer space, but they're finding things that then connections that we can't yet appreciate. In other words, they're sending us telegrams from the future that we can't read yet.
Yeah. Well, this future thinking, though, goes against the current immediate gratification society that we're in right now. We want answers quickly. We want answers right away. Some answers you got to wait for. So if you have the patience and you let the scientists do their thing, who knows what will happen. Don't expect it all now.
So to ask you to speculate, Bob, why do you think that is? We talked about the gap between this idea that people are generally good, and on the other side, we watch the 6 o'clock news. And it's just a constant spree of murder, violence, death, increasing prices, people being homeless, people being put out of work, the economy being in catastrophe. It's this constant fear, which it seems opposed to that principle that everybody is good. And if I watch the 6 o'clock news every day, I probably wouldn't want to go outside, let alone go to Toronto. And so I guess I'm asking someone who, I recognize you're not a sociologist, but why do you suspect that this is happening? Why is there such a gap?
Well, there's a saying in the newsroom: if it bleeds, it leads. And they're obsessed with all the bad things that happen in the world. It's all about who died today. That's really what the news is. I don't watch the news either. I find it depressing. I'm on the news once in a while, but I'm one of the few people that's talking about something positive. I tell them about what science just discovered, and that's why they like having me on. I'm a break from all the terrible stuff they're always reporting on. But again, when you talk about who died today, you're talking about a small minority of people, and the rest of us are just getting on with our lives. And but that's not. Do you want to hear that Joe Blow walked down the street today and had his dog pooped on a fire hydrant? No, that's not a. They say dog bites man. That's not a story. Man bites dog. Now that's a story.
Yeah.
And. So it's got to be the odd, the unusual. We like the bizarre, and it turns out that it's all about war and conflict. I guess we also have a fear that maybe that stuff's going to come to us, and so we want to know about it. It's sad. It's just the nature of the business. But if that's all you watch, then you're narrow-minded.
Or all you see in your feed on your phone, or all you see on your iPad, or whatever.
Yeah, it's sort of ironic, that here we are living in the best of times, and we all talk about the worst of times. And I'll tell you what happened when I came back from my trip around the world, and after I had this positive experience of people being so good. The very night I got back to Toronto, I was invited to a party. And these were all friends of mine, and it was a big house party. Ah, sure, great. So I showed up at this party. The first thing I noticed was how much food there was. There was a table covered in food. And I had been through countries where food's a major issue, and people just get what they can every day. First was that. And then in conversation with people were talking about how much tax they're paying, how much their mortgage is, and everybody was complaining about stuff. But the things they were complaining were all first world problems, And I was going, hey, it's not that bad. We got a great country. Oh, no, I'm paying way too much tax, and I've done it. And I had to leave. I couldn't stay. I had to leave. And I had to go home and sit down and think, okay, this is my culture. This is what we do here. Because humans seem to have a need to complain about things, even when things are really, really good. And I had to resolve that in my mind that we could do. But let's not get obsessed with that.
How did you resolve it? How did you not want to just go back to where things were simpler?
Well, I determined that I won't do that. I won't play that game. Even though I pay a lot of taxes, they bother me a lot. I don't spend my time obsessed about it. There's too much in the world to appreciate.
I had a similar reaction when I came back home after traveling abroad and in countries where not only food but water is an issue, but the government can sometimes just not exist. Police forces are nowhere to be seen. So if something goes wrong, you don't call 911. That's not an option for you in many parts of the world. And what I recognized was, yes, what you just said, that there are these first world problems that are really, truly not important. But there was another thing, too, that there are things that we have built in our society that are important and need to be cherished that many other countries don't have. And I'm talking not just institutions, but I'm talking about science and the curiosity for science and a whole education system that has provided wonderful opportunity for so many people. And that I'm not saying that we should hold and build walls around this and make sure that nobody else has it, but I'm saying that we seem to have lost an appreciation for these basic things. While we're fighting to cut our income taxes, we've lost our appreciation. And I think that's something that I learned when I came home for sure. And I don't know if you found the same thing.
Yeah, a little bit of that. It would be nice if we held scientists in a little higher regard in that way, so that you don't have to win the Nobel Prize to get $1 million.
Right.
And that's the challenge that a lot of kids face in the university. You could be a scientist or you could be a lawyer. You make a lot more being a lawyer, even a doctor. So being the scientist, it's noble, but it's not rich. You're not going to get rich yet. Maybe we could look at that.
Well, there is a culture of where the nerds have risen to power, so to speak, in Silicon Valley, where you have lots of millionaires and even billionaires who have risen by sheer strength of their intellect and their curiosity and their ability to apply problems to building a cell phone, for example, or mobile payments, or whatever it is.
That's technology. That's applied.
And this is what I was going to ask you: is how about pure science? How does that fit in?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, those billionaires wouldn't have anything if it wasn't for the Michael Faradays of the world who figured out the fundamental principles behind all of those things. And if you just focus on the technology, all you're doing is taking what you have and making it better. There's not as much innovation there of thought. There's innovation of the technology, but not a brand new thought that comes along that nobody's ever thought of before. And you say, hey, here's $1 million. Go pursue that. I don't know how much of that is happening at fundamental research.
I had a fellow CBC broadcaster actually on the program, Terry O'Reilly, who said that we miss the power of the idea. That so many CEOs and marketing specialists and people in power forget that the most powerful thing in the world is the idea, and that the only thing that can create an idea is the human mind.
Yes. When we were crossing the millennium there back in 2000, there was a lot of thought about time. Our thought of time changed, because you hear about CEOs talking about a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan. Well, how about a millennium plan? How about a 1,000-year plan? Can we keep doing what we're doing now for 1,000 years in the future? Because in the year 2000, we look back at how far we'd come since the year 1000, which is astounding. The year 1000, man, that was just before the Dark Ages happened, and the bubonic plague and all these really horrible things that humanity went through. And we got out of that thanks to science and technology and enlightenment and education, and it got us to the world that we're in today. Okay. So now we're looking at, when you look at it through the news, man, we got another war coming. We got, measles are coming back and all this stuff. Oh my God, we're all going to die. And the climate's going to, we're overpopulated. We're eating up and burning up everything on the planet. Okay, well, science told us that. So let's take that knowledge and just rejig how we're going to control our numbers, control our emissions, control our consumption, and proceed. Get on with it, for Christ's sake. Let's get on to the future. And figure out, what can we keep doing for 1,000 years? I think it's a really interesting question to ask.
I don't even think I think it's interesting, but I also think that it's exciting. I don't know, maybe I'm the only person to hear you say that and think to myself, ooh, cool, where would I fit into a 1,000-year plan, this grand ambition? Where are we as human beings going to be in 1,000 years?
Yeah.
Not only do we get to imagine it, because science fiction writers, for example, imagine this all the time.
And it's usually an Armageddon. It's usually terrible.
Right. So why don't we try to imagine it and actualize it in one where it's not an Armageddon? And furthermore, this constant refrain that the reason that Fermi's paradox, for example, the reason that we can't find any intelligent life in the universe is because they all blow themselves up once they reach the capability of doing so. Maybe we're going to do the same, but maybe the only way we won't is by planning our way out of it.
Yeah, get to a Star Trek universe where everything's perfect, right?
Right, hopefully.
Somewhere in between those two, there's going to be this. But I'm optimistic because we're smart. We're smart creatures. Look at how far we've come. Look at how far we've come from. I don't know if when you were in Africa, if you went to the Olduvai Gorge, which is where they have found, it's where they found some of our oldest ancestors, the Australopithecines, and that's where Homo habilis was the first tool makers, 2 million years ago. And I was shown some of those stone tools. And the first time the guy said, "Here, hold one." And I looked at it and I said, "It looks just like a stone you'd find in a river." He said, "It was a stone you find in a river because it was all rounded." He said, "But look at one side of it. It's been chipped away and it's got a sharp edge to it." I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Now hold it in your hand." And I held it in my hand, and it fit.
Wow.
It fit my hand. And all of a sudden, I was directly connected to someone 2 million years ago who used that very tool to make dinner, to get meat off a bone. And how far we've come from those simple cobbled tools to the camera that took the picture of the Earth from the far side of the moon, to the technology that you're using right now to record me, to the phone that you have sitting here on the table, to the connectedness that we have, to the medical technology that we have. I mean, how does a headache pill know where your head is? How does it do that? How does it know where your head is? Pills can do that. Like, we've figured out so much that we take for granted, and we can keep doing that. I think that we're smart enough to engineer our way through this little bottleneck that we're in right now where things got away on us. We didn't know about all of these connections, that what was coming out the tailpipe of a car was going to change the climate. They didn't know that when they first started making cars. It took a while to figure that out. Well, now we have figured it out.
Now we know.
We keep figuring these things out. So, okay, now that we know, let's act on it. Let's act on it and modify our technology. We modify our technology. I think of it as evolution, not revolution. Very often in climate, it gets polarized. You get the tree huggers on one side and you get the evil oil barons on the other side. Well, as soon as you polarize it like that, people on either side just dig in their heels and nothing happens. And if something does happen, if it's a revolution, there's violence and people die and it's chaotic. Evolution is when you take what you have and you evolve it into something better. So we've done that with sound. So if you wanted to hear music more than 150 years ago, you had to go to a concert. Live was the only way you could hear music. Then Thomas Edison invented a thing called the wax recorder, and it was a cylinder with this hard wax on it, and a needle would scribble wiggly lines on it. And now you could play it at home. You could play music at home. You didn't have to go to a concert. But the wax wore out quickly, so then they became plastic cylinders. Then the plastic cylinders, they're hard to store because they take up a lot of room. So then they were flattened into discs. And we had vinyl. But vinyl gets scratchy. So then we went to reel-to-reel tape so that you could record your own music and get hours of it on there. But the tape had a hiss to it. Then they were big. So then we went to cassettes, which were smaller. And then we went to CDs, which don't have any, there's no contact, so it was nice, clean sound, but they're still big. Then we got rid of moving parts altogether, and we went to MP3 players, which is just a computer chip, and now you got the iPod and the iPhone, and you can listen to all the music in the world on your phone with noise-canceling earbuds, but you're still just listening to music. So the art of listening to music didn't change, it just got better. The technology evolved in a remarkable way. Well, let's do that with energy. Let's do that with transportation. Let's do that because we haven't. The engines that are in cars today, these combustion engines, that technology is more than 150 years old. The 4-cycle combustion engine. It's had its day. Let's let it go.
And give it credit for what it did.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's
right.
Incredible. It's had the hell engineered out of it.
Right, but like the steam engine in the 18th and 19th centuries, it's time
right.
to move on.
Yes. But there's the phrase, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And the Iron Age didn't end because we ran out of iron. It's because we evolved into something new. So the oil age, we're in the oil age now. We may run out of it if we burn it all up, but let's get on to something else. There's no shortage of energy on the Earth. There's lots of energy falling out of the sky every day, blowing on the wind, coming out of the ground. We can find other ways to capture it and use it.
Well, and Bob, I really love this idea of you holding that stone in Olduvai Gorge in Africa and being connected to 2 million years before, being connected to your ancestor.
Yeah.
Well, what are we now creating that we might connect to our descendants 2 million years from now if we have them? And I think that alone is a noble pursuit, to try to leave something behind and make sure that we have our descendants looking back 2 million years from now, not because we're self-interested and want to be, want our selfie to last for 2 million years, but because we want to not only reach back, but also reach forward. And Bob, I've got one final question for you, because this is an electric conversation. There's so many more things I want to ask you, because you have so many things that you know about. But if there was one thing that you could pick out of all of your, not only wealth of knowledge that you have, but that your curiosity, one thing that you could spend a whole other hour talking about in a podcast or doing a program about, that people aren't as aware of as they should, or they're not aware of of at all, what would that one thing be?
I would like to think that it's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking. We look back in the Renaissance when art and science came together, and it was a really beautiful thing. Paintings got perspective so that they had depth to them. Da Vinci did that, and it was a marvelous time of enlightenment because critical thinking and education was valued, along with art. And I would like to think that science is like a modern Renaissance, that it's a way of looking at the world to understand it and to figure out how to live with it. And I would like people to be looking back to say, boy, weren't they clever? Weren't they clever in how they thought back then to give us this sustainable world that we have today? It looked like we were going down the toilet, but we got out of it. We got out of it because of really clever thinking and innovation. So I would like that. I mean, as far as technology goes, we're going to leave them plastic.
Yeah.
We're going to leave them plastic. I've thought about this. If our civilization completely eliminated itself and alien prospectors or alien archaeologists came to the Earth way in the future when humans are far gone, they're going to dig down and see all these different layers. They're going to see a layer of plastic.
The Anthropocene of plastic.
Yeah, that's right. And they'll see it and they'll say, wow, this is amazing stuff. What is this? What is this stuff?
George Carlin had a skit where he talked about, the environmental movement. I mean, the comedian George Carlin. And he said, well, what if the whole purpose of, everyone asking, what is the point of life? What is the meaning of life? And he said, what if Mother Nature just couldn't figure out how to make plastic on her own, had to find a way to do it, created humans to do it for her? Well, now we have this new paradigm, Earth plus plastic. Human beings can be shuffled off. So when people ask you the meaning of life, you say, plastic. Asshole. Yeah. Well, I hope we leave them more than that. But, right.
But if we can leave them, a way of thinking that persists, that would be nice. If they're still thinking that way in the future.
Bob, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
You too. To learn more about Bob McDonald, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca, and there you can find all other episodes and a way to get in touch with me and give me your suggestions for future ones. Now, your quote of the week is a first for this podcast. I actually pulled a quote from the conversation that I've had with Bob. Here goes. Science is an organized way of being curious. Bob McDonald. Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for our wonderful music, and special thanks to Casa Cappuccino in Barrie, Ontario, for hosting us in their cafe for this conversation. Next week, we're talking with award-winning Canadian journalist Sally Armstrong. I'll see you then.